front of the truck. Since the 85's still torn apart in the garage, I needed a way to transport lumber. And like most older trucks, I needed quite a bit of TLC. So, I spent most of last summer making sure it was far more drivable and reliable. But before we get into here and see how it looks now, let me take you back to where it started. I come out one day to go run some errands. And once it fires up, I see the charge gauge just pegged to the right, like this. The first time it did it, there was actually a little bit of smoke coming up from behind the dash also. I was hoping it was just an alternator issue, so I went ahead and pulled that to go get tested. I also inspected the wiring. No surprise there, it's all brittle, corroded, plenty of random spliced in wires. While doing that, I see this under the battery tray. So I yanked that nasty thing out and went and got the one from the 85 and put it in. The alternator tested fine, so I put that back in. I also put new ends on the bolt regulator wires, and I also swapped out the regulator from the 85. And unfortunately, none of this fixed the issue. So, knowing it was time to show this truck some love, I went ahead and made a list of all the items I wanted to replace to make it far more reliable than what it was. For the charging system, I'll get a new alternator, I'll swap out the main charge cables, and I'll likely have to open the dash to inspect the gauges. For the starting items, I'll replace the battery, the main wires, and a few solenoids. For the ignition, I'll replace the plugs, wires, coil, and I'll rebuild the distributor too. For the brakes, I'll replace the booster, the master, and the front pads and rotors. For general engine, I plan to swap out the Edelbrock Carb and valve covers. I'll put those on the 85, and in their place I'll put on the 85 valve covers and a Holley Carburetor that I rebuilt, and I also need to swap out the header gaskets. This right here is my initial plan, but by the time I was done, it expanded quite a bit. And now, for a quick teardown montage. These are the valve covers from the 85. I'd already cleaned these and put a nice wrinkle finish paint job on them. So a quick bead of RTV black, squish in the gaskets, and another small bead, and they're ready to install. Once both sides were installed, I plugged up the holes, torqued down the bolts. And with those installed, I decided to continue on with the brake system. And boy, this has to be one of the most frustrating brake jobs I've ever done. You should check out this dude's video linked here for a full guide on all this lunacy. But for this video, I'm just going to cover some of the fun. My first surprise is that the rotor was stuck between a hub and a bearing, so that all had to come out in one piece. Next up, for the bearing housing, there's this grease nipple that sits right in front of one of the bolts. In addition to that, my dust cover came off in pieces. A few of the bearing housing bolts were seized, so a little heat there to get those out. Once I got that off, it's time for some old gasket scraping. For the dust cover, while you can run without one, I didn't want to. I also couldn't hunt down a used or new one. So I wire wheeled the whole thing and opted to weld some reinforcement onto these tabs. And then coat the entire thing in chassis paint, and hopefully it'll last a bit longer. For this rotor and hub, I attempted to press the bearing apart, but everything just ended up squishing. I ended up having to take this down to a local shop, and thankfully they were able to get it all apart for me. And I didn't have to attempt again to find another obsolete part. I was also worried that I might have gouged the hub at some point when I was trying to get the bearing off. Luckily it all cleaned up nice with no visible defects. And this rotor assembly was like a puzzle that I had to figure out, everything being put back together in a very particular order. First I had to drive the new studs in, but that required propping it up in some funky way to be able to get them all in. Once that's on, you can put on the new seal, then the new bearings. Pressing on the new bearings was interesting because the studs were already in, so I had to find a way to prop it up to keep it level. And to get the bearing fully seated, I had to use the new races to get high enough above the hub Then I was able to press those on and use a little mechanical agitation on each side to assist it to go down. A little bit of cussing and swearing later, and I was done with this first hub. Then I squished that all onto the front shaft by torquing down the axle nut. And lastly, you can put the bearing housing bolts in. But those have to go through the rotor, and you have no visibility behind it or what you're doing. And it also needs to be free spinning, so I had to go ahead and jack up the other side of the vehicle. And if you don't have that axle nut tightened all the way, the bearing housing is sitting all the way back, when you put these bolts in, it will pop that new seal right out. Go ahead and ask me how I know that. So plenty of cussing later, I had both sides installed. A bead of RTV black around the firewall and the bolts, and that should stop any water from getting in behind there. I went ahead and shot the new one with a little bit of that wrinkle paint like the valve covers, just for looks. The common thing to do for these trucks is to swap out the booster for a 3/4 ton model. It's a little bit smaller of a diameter, but it gives a bit more braking power. It also gives extra clearance for any aftermarket valve covers. The first master cylinder I ordered was wrong, so now I'm unbolting and removing the headers. The blower fan in this truck is seized, so I'm just bypassing the heater core here by removing the hoses for a little bit of extra clearance. And then connecting the feed hose directly from the pump back into the block. The rebuild of the fan and heater assembly will be in a later video, but not part of this series. This bolt here was the worst out of all of them. It's only able to turn the wrench about an 1/8 turn, then I had to rotate the wrench for the offset angle, do another 1/8 turn, rotate the wrench, 1/8 turn, rotate the wrench, 1/8 turn. I was just glad none of the bolts were actually seized up on this. After fighting the driver's side header for some time, I realized it was just easier to take the starter out. And on the passenger side, the oil filter needed to be removed for extra clearance. And with the headers out, I ran a tap through all the holes to make sure those are all nice and clean. The header gaskets were leaking a little, and that's most likely due to this unlevel mating surface. So first I took a flat file to them, and here's how they look after a few minutes. So then I just kept filing till I was happy with it. Afterwards I did a little bit of hillbilly porting on the inside edges here. Afterwards, I sanded all the exterior of the pipes and cleaned everything up. And finally, I took them out back and gave them a few coats of high-temp header paint. After letting the paint cure for a couple days, I was able to install them. I put some blue tape on the outside of the headers, the side facing the frame. This was an attempt to prevent any scratching to the new paint. All this work refinishing ended up being kind of futile, as you'll see later. On the driver's side, it had two studs sticking out of the block, so I was able to hang the header on those. Passenger side, despite it coming out relatively smooth, this trans dipstick caused plenty of issues trying to get it back in. At this point, I was waiting for the new header bolts to arrive, so we'll install the gaskets a little later. I can get the collector gaskets installed. And I added a little bit of copper anti-seize on each one of those bolts. And that's where we're going to actually end this video. Let's check in on that list I made at the beginning. For the ignition, the wires and coil are removed. For the brakes, the master is out. The booster and fronts are replaced. For the engine, the carb is removed. The headers are mostly done. And the valve cover gaskets are replaced. Now I decided to add a few extra items. And for the engine, I'll replace all the vacuum lines. I want to add in a fuel filter. And I'm also going to fix the muffler, which is rattling because of all the broken hangers. I'm going to add an interior section. I need to inspect the cluster. I need to fix a broken gas pedal, and I want to replace all the switches in the column. Here's a small preview of what's coming up next time. So that's it for now, and as always, thanks for watching.